So as you know, today we have a program called Living with Pot. So as the first G8 country to legalize recreational marijuana use, Canada has come to grips with several issues related to this drugs. And we wanted, as RCIS, to explore this through our unique scientific lens, and are delighted to bring together three researchers whose work relates to cannabis. I'm very pleased that leading the discussion today is Dr. Leslie Campbell, and I'll say a few words about you if I may, Leslie. So Leslie is an associate professor in the Department of Chemistry and Biology at Ryerson. She's the first researcher in Canada to receive an NSERC funding to study cannabis. That's pretty remarkable. This is all like pretty amazing new territory for us. And critically, she has a license to grow and study cannabis plants. Yeah. She describes herself as a botanist or a professional gardener, specializing in plant evolutionary biology, and she's motivated to generate new knowledge to solve applied problems in agriculture and conservation in general. And as a principal and investigator, Leslie leads a vibrant team of graduate students and researchers and an army of undergrads who are passionate about experimental science. Leslie also owns Growing Scientific Solutions, a business that finds innovative solutions to maximize yield in Canada's industrial cannabis production. She's author of numerous scientific publications, lab manuals, and reports. As an educator, Leslie is intent on creating an exceptional experience for undergrad, grad, and non-traditional students, and has taught classes in not only botany, but evolution, ecology, conservation, and of course undergraduate research, and even one of my favorite topics, biostatistics. Math rules, I know, okay. So I'll welcome Leslie to the stage, and she'll be introducing the panelists, and thank you very much for joining us, Leslie.
Thank you guys for coming. Thanks for being here, and thanks for engaging in some really important scientific dialogue, and thank you RCIS for inviting me and the other panelists. This is really wonderful to be able to engage with our neighbors to talk about this work. So I want to introduce our other two panelists. Dr. Ruth Ross is actually one of my personal heroes. She has mentored me even though she doesn't know this. Because she has been one of the pioneers in Canada for cannabis research. She is a professor and chair in the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology here at the University of Toronto. Dr. Ross researches the molecular pharmacology of cannabinoids and related lipid signaling networks and systems. Her work provides insight into the effects of cannabis smoking and the potential for cannabis as a medicine. Together with medicinal chemists, she is developing novel small molecule therapeutics for major diseases including chronic pain, addiction, cancer, and diabetes. Please welcome Ruth. And Dr. Tony George is our second panelist. He is also one of the leaders in Toronto and in Canada, trying to help us all understand the consequences of dealing with some major narcotics, including cannabis. So he's a professor here of psychiatry at the University of Toronto and chief of addictions at CAMH. We're among giants right now, people. His research focuses on the understanding the biology and treatment of addictions in people with serious mental health illnesses, including schizophrenia and mood disorders. Dr. George directs a program of research that studies the biological basis of addiction and its relation to serious mental illness, with a focus on tobacco and cannabis use in schizophrenia. Please welcome Dr. George. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to each give a very brief synopsis of our research, just to give you an idea of the kind of breadth that's available of knowledge and expert knowledge here on the panel, to give you some ideas of where we're going to go with it today. the magic of technology. I'm good with some things, but not lights. All right, so I'm a botanist. I find plants fascinating, and I've spent the last 4 years studying cannabis, which isn't that long. And so there are many people upon whom I have started working, whose research has allowed me to build more information. But cannabis, cannabis is the new plant of interest in my lab. So what is cannabis? Here's a picture. You guys have all seen this, I'm sure. It turns out cannabis is a fascinating annual plant. It can be as short as a foot. It can be over 3 meters tall. Depends on how good you are at growing it and how big a pot you give it. But the fascinating thing about cannabis is it comes originally from the areas of India and Pakistan. It's since dispersed globally around the world, although I have not heard of any living populations on Antarctica, but who knows. We have done a whole pile of work agriculturally breeding this plant to produce 3 major items. The first is fiber. We have a whole pile of hemp clothes and rope and sails that have been produced out of this plant. We then modified it also to be a food, and so we now have oil seeds that are a rich source of nutrients, omega-3 fatty acids in particular. And then finally, we have also spent a lot of time thinking about how to extract 2 particular medicinal compounds out of it, including cannabidiol and THC, or cannabinol, sorry. But I'm going to let the other panelists talk about those two chemicals. I want to talk a little bit about what people are actually selling. So when you go to the store that sells cannabis, you will purchase one of these plants, but not both. So there is a male plant and there is a female plant, and the male plant we do not sell. We only sell female plants as a product that's either recreationally or medicinally used. And so you can see the female on the left, you can see those thin fibers, those are the stigmas or the female genitalia, and that plant is radically modifying its physiology right at this moment to produce all these tiny hairs all over the stigmas. Those stigmas actually then fill up with a precursor to THC and CBD. We call it cannabigerol, and eventually through aging and maturity, that chemical CBG translates and transforms into two compounds. The males also produce those 2 compounds. So you could technically consume male cannabis and it would be fine. But the problem is that males are tiny compared to females. And so if we're thinking about lots of production, which some people really want, if they want lots of material, they focus on the female. It's usually larger, and and so because there's more biomass, we get more medicinal compounds out of it. The other wacky thing is, sorry, I forgot to mention that the males, if they pollinate the females, radically drop the production of THC and CBD in the female. So if you find a male in your population somewhere, you will be reducing your cannabidiol and THC production in your females. So don't keep males around. As a single mom says. All right, so when we go to industrial production facilities, in fact, you will see no males anywhere around. And instead, the way they propagate them is through clonal propagation. So they take cuttings off a mother plant and they create lots and lots of female plants. This helps to improve consistency, but that's something that my lab is spending a lot of time on, is looking at how single clones, and those 4 plants are clonally identical, genetically identical, how we can modify their morphology and their chemical production facilities in order to radically change their cannabinoid outputs. And so with that, I think what's fascinating, the final part of my lab, is to ask, how can cannabinoids be used in natural ecosystems? I'm not a human biologist, and so what you will notice is that there are only some organisms that can actually have receptors in their body that can use cannabinoids. So mammals all have receptors for cannabinoids, like us, like horses. But insects, so the hookah smoking insect that was in Alice in Wonderland has none. And so we are kind of interested in those organisms as well. But I'm going to leave that next to the human biologist to tell us more about that. All right, Ruth, would you like to?
Okay, thank you. That's great. Thanks very much for the invitation. So I've been working on cannabinoid research for over 20 years now. And it's been a really interesting journey just to see how things have gone. So I had my kids, and I had a 5-year career break, and then I came back to science and happened to end up in the lab of Roger Pertwee, who some of you might have heard of, in University of Aberdeen in Scotland. And he's been working on cannabinoid research really since, I think, the 50s and 60s, and was part of making big discoveries around the THC structure and so on. So, but at that time when I started there in '95, cannabis and cannabinoids were such a kind of non-interesting topic to most people. So we go to the British Journal of Pharmacology meetings and the British Pharmacological Society meetings, and I'd be a postdoc presenting my stuff, and we'd always get the last slot on the last day, and there was 3 people in the audience, and it was very just wasn't really considered a particularly fashionable topic. And then it kind of took off again with we got new small molecules that Big Pharma were working on that were for metabolic syndrome, targeting the cannabinoid system. And then things got all interesting again, and lots of people were in the research area. And then those crashed out due to side effects, and then it became a non-topic again, really hard to get grants and funding. And then I found myself in Canada 6 years ago, and of course now it's again something people are really interested in, cannabinoid and cannabis research. So it's like keeping old clothes. If you keep them long enough, they get fashionable again. So I'm just going to give a quick some of my slides have got lots of information in them, and I won't have time to go into lots of detail, but we can come back. I've got all the detail there just in case people are interested in coming back to any of it. So I often call my cannabis talks mixed messages, because on many levels there are lots of mixed messages on this kind of topic. So the cannabinoids, so we've heard about plant cannabinoids. I'm going to just talk about endocannabinoids. So there are endocannabinoids, so these are compounds that are produced in your brain and lots of parts of your body. The key ones here are anandamide and 2-arachidonyl glycerol. They're involved in lots of different brain functions. They're involved in appetite, pain processing, learning and memory, stress and fear responses. So they're key players, neuromodulators in your brain pathways. Then there's the phytocannabinoids, which we've heard a bit about from Leslie. So 2 main players, THC and CBD. These are the only 2 I've highlighted here, but people for a number of years have been looking at other phytocannabinoids and their potential as therapeutics, or their potential of modulating and moderating the effects of THC and CBD. So that's another whole topic. THC is the big player in things like euphoria, appetite stimulation, analgesia. It's an antiemetic. It may be the bad guy in terms of psychosis, has effects on memory, hallucinations. So that's a small list there. CBD doesn't cause a high. It has been verified to have anti-epileptic effects in a certain small group of particular epilepsies in children. So that's a quick summary of the phytocannabinoids. I often also talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I've been trying to get the theme music from the movie to overlay my slide, but I'm not smart enough to do that. Maybe someone in the younger generation can help me to do that. But anyway, the good, we may talk about the kind of medical effects. So there's evidence of pain relief in MS and other types of neuropathic pain. There is some good clinical data on that. This is THC mediated largely, we think. There's antiemetic, anti-nausea effects of THC in chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. Appetite stimulation potentially effective in cancer-induced weight loss. And then there's the, as I mentioned, epilepsy with CBD. So these are, that's the sum total of the good clinical evidence that we've got for therapeutic use of cannabis, and in particular THC and CBD. What we could call the bad might be impaired short-term memory, motivation and cognition effects, driving impairment, and hyperemesis is this hyper-vomiting that some people are experiencing with related to cannabis use. The ugly you might call, and we'll hear more about this from Tony, I'm sure, risk of psychosis and schizophrenia in vulnerable individuals, potentially cannabis use disorders, so that's dependence on cannabis, and maternal use in pregnancy and nursing is another example of something we know very little about but could have some fairly unpleasant effects. So how does it work? So there's the three classes of cannabinoids: endocannabinoids, phytos, and synthetic small molecules. Just talking about THC here, so CBD, we're still in the process of trying to work out the molecular target for CBD. We actually don't know how it works. So there are a number of potential targets for CBD, but we don't have a good molecular mechanism for the effect of CBD yet. It's one of the things I've been working on, a number of people are working on. But for THC, we do know how it works. It acts on the CB1 receptor, which is widely expressed across the brain, and it acts to modulate signals that control brain function. So endos work on there, phytos work on their THC, and so do synthetic molecules. So the effects of cannabis. Now, in blue here, I've got what the endocannabinoids do, and in green, cannabis. So you've got, for example, in the cortex, endocannabinoids in blue here are released. They're involved in things like cognition, attention, motivation, and cannabis, as we know, causes effects on cognition. The hypothalamus, another key brain region, is involved in appetite, controlling appetite. Endocannabinoids are key players in the hypothalamus. They signal to stimulate appetite and control other metabolic functions. And by interacting with this system, exogenous cannabis, THC, causes appetite stimulation. Another example is the hippocampus, involved in learning and memory. The endocannabinoids are key players in learning and memory. They're released during various memory events. And the THC in cannabis has effects on memory. Brainstem, spinal cord, vomit reflex, and pain control. The endocannabinoids are involved in pain control and modulating pain. And cannabis has anti-nausea effects, but it can also paradoxically cause hyperemesis. It has pain-relieving effects, but it can also paradoxically cause hyperalgesia, so that's extreme pain. So finally, there's the amygdala, involved in emotion and fear. Endocannabinoids are key players. There's lots of CB1 receptors in the amygdala. And then cannabis, THC has effects on mood and potentially causing paranoia and so on. So the bottom line is you've got these endocannabinoids. They're being produced to balance things out, affect various physiologies and pathophysiologies, and then you impose on that THC. Acts on the same system. It can either mimic the effect of the endocannabinoids, so you've got appetite stimulations mimicking the effect. It can potentially disrupt the endocannabinoid system and interfere with that balance or dysregulate the endocannabinoid system. So it can have those different effects. Cannabis controversies, we're always talking about this, various different things to throw into this mix of whether there's a risk or a benefit, the dose and type of cannabis, genetics, age of use. These are three key things that people talk about often in terms of the pharmacology. I'm rushing through these, but I just want to highlight things that we might want to return to in our discussion. So the endocannabinoids. So they are considered potentially to be autoprotective in some situations, pain being an example. So if you have some nerve injury or some, it's particularly prevalent in neuropathic pain. So what your body does, it starts pumping out endocannabinoids, and these are acting as analgesics. They're relieving the pain. So that's what's called an autoprotective mechanism. So they're helping to make the pain better. But in other instances, endocannabinoids might actually be auto-impairing. In other words, they may be making the symptoms worse. So an example is fatty liver disease and obesity, for example, where there's too many endocannabinoids being, for some reason, they're being overactivated. And in actual fact, they're making the condition worse. So when you block the system, you actually get an improvement in liver profile of liver damage, for example. And then, of course, there's the question marks here. What about depression, anxiety, PTSD, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, psychosis? Is the endocannabinoid system autoprotective? Is it auto-impairing? Is it overactivated to make the thing worse? Or is it actually acting in such a way to make it better? And these are the big questions. We don't know that. We don't know whether it's at the early stage of a disease they may be trying to protect, and then they may suddenly overshoot and start to make things worse. So you can see there's a whole lot of, there's many, many decades of science right there trying to work out, of research trying to work that out. So this is my last slide. And here I'm just trying, you can see it ends with 2 question marks. So we're going to end up with more questions than answers. But these are the different things that you throw into the mix. You've got the dose of cannabis. So people will say to me, oh, you've been working on cannabis for 25 years. If I smoke it, what will happen? And I basically give them this blank slide with the 2 question marks. So here's the dose, high, low, medium. Components, I've just put there THC, CBD, but of course there's lots of other ones, other components of cannabis in the plant that may be very relevant. There's the ratio of these 2. There's the route of administration, smoke, vape, edible, others. And there's the frequency of use, occasional, daily. Then there's the next level, which is the effect of THC. So this is a key thing people often kind of miss. THC, it's a bit kind of annoyingly scientific, annoyingly pharmacological, but it's what's called a partial agonist. So partial agonists can actually act as agonists or antagonists, depending on the level of the endocannabinoid system. And this is a really important bit of information. Of course, I would say that because I'm a kind of geeky pharmacologist, but it is important because THC can activate the system. It can actually overactivate the system depending on whether the system's tuned up. And it can actually also act as an antagonist. It can block the system. So this is where you get lots of confusion with people taking high doses and seeing different effects, or people saying, well, this really helps me, but then someone with an imbalance in their endocannabinoid system gets a totally different effect that might actually be dangerous. So the other thing is the intensity and timing, so a rapid effect, a delayed effect, mild or strong, depending on some of these things like route of administration, for example, or other variables. Then you've got your endocannabinoid system. We could say that in health it's balanced. Maybe in certain diseases it's imbalanced, as I mentioned. Then you've got, is it acting as an autoprotectant or an auto-impairing? So another filter through which you've got to go. Then there's genes. So how quickly do you metabolize THC? Do you metabolize it quickly or slowly? Are you a rapid metabolizer or not? That's genetic. Your endocannabinoid levels, do you have high levels or low levels? There's certain polymorphisms that affect that. Do you have susceptibility genes for psychosis or addiction? That will also affect certain risk factors, and maybe Tony will be mentioning some of that as well. And then there's the age. We talk a lot about adolescents. There's also the young adult population between, say, 19 and 26 who may be in a particular risk group as well that we have very little information for. So the bottom line is we've got this huge question mark. What will the effect be? It may improve symptoms, it may exacerbate symptoms. It may have a strong and dangerous effect, or it might have a minor effect. So when people ask me, what will it do? That's why I have this slide that basically looks like this. So that's it. Thank you.
So it's a thank you to RCIS for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and it's also a pleasure to follow two distinguished scientists like Leslie and Ruth. And so I'm the clinician in the trio. Ruth mentioned she was a geeky pharmacologist. I like to think I'm a combination of physician and geeky pharmacologist. So, but I am a psychiatrist and I do addictions at CAMH, and have done that in the context of trying to understand substance abuse in people who have serious mental illness, like mood disorders and schizophrenia. So I want to sort of try to answer a couple of basic questions. And so the first question I want to try to answer is this, because I spend all my day focusing on pathology and people getting addicted and people who are psychotic and depressed and suicidal. So is cannabis addictive? And it says, keep off the grass, wish I could. And so here's the answer. And this is not an easy question to answer, but I think the best evidence is this. And this comes from the US, a colleague of mine named Jim Anthony in Michigan. And he looked at people who tried various drugs, including tobacco, cocaine, heroin, alcohol, and cannabis, right at the bottom here. And also then of those who tried it, who became dependent on the drug. That is, progressed to daily use that became problematic. And so addiction was then defined as what is column 3, cumulative occurrence of getting dependent on a drug divided by anyone who took it. And that's the last column on the right-hand side, the percent capture rate. As you can see from that data, it turns out that the most addictive drug is tobacco. 1/3 of people who try tobacco get addicted on it. That may be even higher with certain populations. So I spent the last 20 years of my life studying tobacco, and what I've concluded is use it once, won't do much, but use it progressively, and at 20 years, you probably have some serious tobacco-related illness, and or you've succumbed to tobacco addiction. But then the other drugs, and cocaine and heroin are still illegal, and their addiction rates, their capture rates, are somewhat less than tobacco. And then the most prolific drug in terms of burden in the healthcare system is alcohol, actually. It's not opioids, it's not stimulants, it's not tobacco, it's actually alcohol. And that is actually half the rate of tobacco. But then look at cannabis. It's only 9%. So we can all go home, right? No. Now let me ask you this. These are in 15 to 45-year-olds. What if I narrow that age range to 15 to 19-year-olds? How many of you think it would be the same, 9%, in 15 to 19-year-olds? How many of you think it would be lower? Maybe 1 or 2. And how many of you think it would be higher? Okay, so this was the Price is Right, that would be. But then how much higher? Double. That's exactly right. It's double. It's about 18%. In fact, that's a bit of a trick question, because if you look at the capture rates for all these other drugs, including tobacco and alcohol, it's actually increased. Maybe not double, but that's saying something. And in the area of what I study, which is people with mental illness, which begins in youth, if that capture rate is higher, and it probably relates to the brain reward systems that are dysfunctional in adolescents. Okay, adolescents are more impulsive, risk-taking, more likely to try things. You tell them, no, don't do that. I have a 17-year-old, they do that. And so, and folks with mental illness also, Ruth showed nice pictures of the brain and some of the areas governing cognition, emotion. Those are all areas that we know that are impaired in people with mental illness and probably make them have rates of problematic use that are 2 to 3 times higher than in the general population. So if the rates in the general population are about 3% for problematic use and 10% for regular use of cannabis, 2 to 3 times the rates typically in people with psychotic and mood disorders. So that's a big burden potentially on those folks if we understand that. And so here's an interesting little tidbit. This is actually THC content, and you know, 2 world experts in this area, so I may be a little bit off here, but this is data from the street, I'm told. And this is THC and CBD content in 1975 versus the present day. And so back in the day of bell-bottoms and disco and Cheech and Chong, the THC rates, or the THC content, was actually quite low, about 3%, and the CBD, the good cannabinoid, was about the same. Are these numbers consistent in the present day? What do you think? Absolutely not. And so this is, at least what I've been told, on the streets of Toronto, this is what we're talking about. So THC 25 to 35% and more. You're talking about some of these other preparations like Shattered are probably in the 80 to 90% range, and almost undetectable CBD. So this is not your mom or dad or grandparents' pot. This is turbocharged stuff, right? And of course, what's the component of cannabis that governs addictiveness and a high? It's the THC. So we've turbocharged that, and this is what licensed producers know. This is what the illegal market knows. What sells is optimizing the THC content, which has important implications for the current era of legalization. And so, you know, just because I'm a psychiatrist, I'll show you this slide. This is actually a bit dated because this suggests that the average age of cannabis use, at least when we published this report in 2014, was about 15. My understanding is that the latest data suggests that the first onset of cannabis is somewhere between age 12 and 13 in Canada. So that age limit, or that age range of first use, is going down. Now what's problematic about that, and Dr. Ross pointed to the fact that we know that cannabis, at least the THC-laden cannabis, is associated with higher rates of mood disorders, anxiety disorders, psychosis like schizophrenia. The best data is actually that cannabis and THC have a pro-psychotic effect. And the age of onset is right when all these disorders first start. So schizophrenia, particularly in men, starts in the late teens. Depression is in the early 20s. Look at anxiety and ADHD is even younger. So it's like a perfect storm in terms of actually the onset of these disorders. So that's a little food for thought. And I'll just leave you with this paper. This is actually, well, I think the title says it all. I can certainly send you the paper. But it's all about the links between cannabis legalization and psychiatric disorders. And so the title is Cannabis Legalization and Psychiatric Disorders, Caveat Emptor. So if anyone knows Latin, caveat emptor means buyer beware. All I did was put an H in front of emptor, as my 17-year-old daughter, who's a freshman in university, says, "Dad, that's got to be the lamest piece of scholarship you've come up with." So, but I blame my co-authors, including Dr. Vaccarino, who's the president of the University of Guelph, so, who said it was funny at Guelph, anyway. So I think he's just trying to make me happy. And so we made these 6 recommendations, and Dr. Hammond couldn't be here, and he's a policy expert in this area. And this is kind of a report card of how we're doing as we enter the legalization area, which, as you know, started on October 17th. And we made 6 recommendations, and they were as follows, and I'll also give you the feedback on the scorecard. So what we've recommended is a national strategy to educate the public about cannabis and its harms. And unfortunately, we've not done well there, and we can certainly talk about that. One thing we've done, I'm sorry about the number scheme gets all mucked up here when we copy it. One thing that legalization has brought very positively, as commercial producers have to do this, is to clearly indicate the content of THC and CBD. Okay, so give them a check mark for that. However, do we have an evidence-based age limit for recreational cannabis? You know, the brain is still developing into one's 20s. So to set it at 18 is a rather interesting thing to do. Now, some of the provinces, in fact, are changing that to 19, including Ontario. We suggested we need a national surveillance strategy before and after legalization. And Dr. Hammond is actually one of the few scientists in Canada who's actually collecting this data before and after legalization, looking at health outcomes, various other outcomes, and unfortunately, we've been a little slow to do that. Last thing, or second to last thing, I told you that some people who try pot will get hooked on it. And so what is our strategy for addressing problematic use? So people, particularly who are young and who have mental illness, are much more prone to developing problematic use. And finally, and this is, a sore spot for me as a physician and an educator, is that we really need to have a robust strategy for training physicians and other healthcare workers about the benefits and risks of cannabis, and we've not done a good job of that. So I will leave you with that, and I will sit down. Thank you.
So that was fantastic, I think. So maybe we'll ask the panelists themselves if they want to reflect on what each other has said for a couple of minutes and maybe make comments, and we'll open it up to the general audience for any questions and comments. So maybe Leslie, you want to start on what you heard and what your thoughts are?
Yep. So I find it's fascinating to see the focus on youth as the most concerning part of the population that will be having access to cannabis, and I entirely agree. But what are the other challenges that might be happening in the rest of the population? I think Ruth mentioned that this is a problem, but what are the other problems that might be happening for seniors, for children, for even 30-year-olds?
Yeah, I think the focus on adolescence is an important one, but I think we need to make sure we don't lose sight of all the other groups involved. And I think one of the key populations here are young adults, as Tony mentioned, just to say those are the group of people for whom it will be legal to buy cannabis, but who also fall into that group where we've still got brain development underway and not completed, and also who are in that very vulnerable group for developing a mental health disorder. So for young men, the real danger zone, I think, is between 15 and 25. So we don't actually understand why psychosis suddenly develops then. We've got some clues, but we don't know, and then you throw cannabis into the mix. So I think we did meet someone, I was at a workshop, met someone from NIH talking about all their years of research, because they've been pretty involved in studying cannabis for a long time in the US. And one of the key groups they were really concerned about was young adults and our lack of data. So we don't have good research data on that group. And of course, they're both probably the biggest group of users, but they're also the biggest market, in inverted commas, for sales and profits. And so that really concerns me. So I'm concerned about that group, and I think it's an important focal point for research.
Tony?
Yeah, I agree completely with what Ruth is saying. And since, psychiatric disorders often start in youth, I think there's a real opportunity for treatment and prevention. And, I guess one of the things I've always wondered about, and this certainly has been an approach taken with other substances like alcohol and even addictive behaviors that aren't substances like gambling, is that, if there's going to be money generated from, commercial sales of this, hopefully some money will be reinvested into treatment and prevention. And one thing that was heartening when that Caveat Emptor paper came out a few months ago is that the federal government announced $82.5 million towards public education over the next 5 years for the entire country, which is great. But when you think about it, if you do the math, which I'm not as good at, that's why I went to psychiatry maybe, is that would work out to about 50 cents per Canadian per year. Now, that's a start, and no doubt there'll be more of that coming, but as we cross the Rubicon over October 17th and came into the legalization area, I think that there's, a lot that we need to do. And look, I'm not going to, say that there's, it's all bad. Obviously, there's a lot of good that will come with legalization, particularly from reducing stigma and, the draconian kind of sentencing for possession. And I think cannabis amnesty is going to be a really good thing. But with I would say, curtailing the science, applying the science to this, will come some problems that we can certainly talk about.
So actually, I would like a little bit more conversation about that specifically. What are the benefits of legalization, and what are the disadvantages of legalization?
Well, I think one obvious benefit is the fact that there's the potential of access to something that isn't laced with fentanyl or pesticides. Hopefully you're the plant professional gardener. I love that. I love gardening. Being a professional gardener sounds fabulous. So I think that's clearly a benefit, is that there's that issue around potentially highly toxic components of illegal product. But and I think it will be a benefit if we get lots more great research data, that we can really get a handle on safety and efficacy, and also harms. But when you say legalization, in different countries there are many different models of legalization. The model that Canada has followed is not necessarily the only model for legalization. Other countries have gone a different route. And there's also, of course, decriminalisation as a first step, where you can have that, deal with some of those issues Tony mentioned, and you can you could deal with that as a first step. Legalization could potentially have progressed slightly more slowly, with more information and more of a kind of slower progression to legalization. Some countries have gone down a model where it is a government control. It's not for profit, so it's a not-for-profit model. So the product's controlled, but the absolute goal is to reduce the number of people taking cannabis, to gather great data, and to put any revenues from that, or any way in which that's organized, goes straight back into research. So it's not corporate for-profit model. So Uruguay, for example, has gone down that route. So there's a number of things in there. So it's a big topic.
Yes.
I mean, the only thing I'd add to that, in terms of focusing on harms, is that one of the great promises of legalization is the curtailing of the illegal market. So if the pot has gone from THC content of 3% in 1975 to 30 to 40% or more on average in 2018, the harms are going to be that much more with that higher potency product. So if the legalized product sets a limit, say 15 or 20%, then the harms would presumably be reduced with people who use recreational cannabis. The downside of that is that there's an old business adage called "customer's always right." Mm-hmm. So if the customer is used to 30, 40%, and then all of a sudden they're said, you can get legalized pot that's 15 to 20%, what do you think the customer's going to say? Yeah. So that is, yet, we have this opportunity to be world leaders in this area in Canada. One area that I'm maybe a little concerned, and I think there's another country that is possibly doing this in a better way, is Portugal. So Portugal has de facto decriminalized all drug use. But one thing that they've done is very clever, and we'll see where this actually goes, but I think the intentions are very good, is that for anyone who develops problematic drug use, they get into trouble, they get addicted, it's impairing their lives, they mandate people into treatment. Mm-hmm. And right now, only about 10% of people who develop an addiction to any drug can actually get treatment here in Canada, and same in the US. So I think, there is the risk. There are some American states, as we know, that have legalized, and there's some early data, at least from Washington State, that rates of problematic cannabis abuse have gone up in the 7 years since Washington State did that. And so one of their big challenges is, if that's true, how do you reduce the burden of illness in the population and minimize risks to people? So.
Very fascinating. So I'm going to ask one devil's advocate question, because I've been hearing a lot about addiction, but it's only 9% of the population. So is it healthy for the rest of us?
Well, my last slide was full of question marks, so that's the
question.
I think it's really an unknown. Healthy, is it healthy, or maybe will it cause harm? Might be another way of looking at it. So, and that's definitely a big question mark, because it totally depends on if you're someone who has a susceptibility to some mental health disorder, for example, then even, it's another important kind of nuance, because even the lower dose may in fact be dangerous for people with some kind of susceptibility. And of course you don't know that when you can't have a genetic test before you choose to do this. So I think it's I think when you think about legalization, giving people the opportunity to make the choice to legally, normalize cannabis use and to legally choose to do it. So you could say, well, that's a good thing. The issue is, can people make a really informed choice around that? If you choose to drink alcohol, you can have a pretty good idea that if one drink or two, what will happen to you. And of course, you also then have the issue around the potential harms of alcohol. And we've got many, many years of data on that. Similarly with tobacco, we've got decades of data. With cannabis, the point of my question marks there was to say, this is really a bit of a huge experiment, and there are lots of unknowns. So to say, is it healthy for the rest of the population, other than those at risk? We don't know, and we don't know who are the people at risk until they kind of emerge having a problem.
And so if we're thinking about tobacco and alcohol as sort of model systems for understanding the rollout of cannabis, no pun intended, would I really didn't plan that one, but who is doing the clinical research to understand this? Where are we getting the funding, and are we actually getting all of the results, or is it similar to the tobacco industry where they are doing the research?
So that's a great question, and I had a colleague at MAC take this on at a sort of looking at all substances, and as he pointed out, we've had a tobacco and alcohol crisis in this country, in most Western countries, for at least 30, 40, 50 years, and governments had a big hand in that. You may have heard that we have an opioid crisis, and that is a complex thing, but pharmaceutical companies, physicians, governments have had a hand in that, patients have had a hand in that, and now we have legalized recreational pot. And I think that's the big question. Is this government controlled system going to complicate things or make things simpler, right? And I think I just put up one of Ruth's question mark slides, because we just don't know. Yeah. So we are kind of rolling the dice here a little bit. And I think I have several hopes about this. I think the fact that this will curtail, kind of law enforcement gone wild, and the harms that it's done, particularly to marginalized populations, including people from ethno-racial groups, has been pretty clear. So that will be a good thing. But it's the health of Canadians that really is potentially at stake here. And if we are making a big nationwide policy change, don't we want to have the facts? Yeah. And so this has been, as you both pointed out, kind of rushed forth. And so it's a bit of an experiment right now. And trust me, the rest of the world is watching us. So I still think, from a positive point of view, a glass is half full approach. We have, we're asking these questions early. so we can actually fine-tune this. The downside is that I think there are other motives, including profit. And, you know, it's the intent that I often hear when I talk to commercial suppliers is, look, our job is to make our shareholders happy. You may have noticed the prices have flung up and then, you know, maybe crashed a little bit. But if there's harms for that, we expect the government to come in and fix things. So that was reminiscent of the opioid crisis, or what happened 20 years ago when we started to aggressively address pain. Pharmaceutical companies said, we'll get the product, we'll get, you know, safe products out there, trust me, they're not addictive, and look where we are now. So
Fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we have a really robust health education, you know, public health approach to this. And it was kind of rolled out as a public health approach to cannabis. You know, the legalization rollout was around public health. And so we really need to make sure that remains absolutely paramount and at the center of things. I think it's really important that any educational materials are all being produced at an arm's length, unbiased, from unbiased groups. So there are all sorts of potentially, if you Google and look for Canadian kind of cannabinoid educational materials, the important thing to know is not all of those are arm's length or unbiased. There are materials and educational platforms and films and websites that are clearly being funded by the industry. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I've seen these in the past. I've seen these kinds of things that happened when there was the whole CB1 antagonists were being released by pharma companies, and they had websites that were educational on the endocannabinoid system, and lots of my colleagues helped come up with that material. And the material is actually very good, but it's not so much what's there, it's what's not there that's often the thing. So there might be great material that's correct, but there may not be robust information on potential harms. So that's something to really keep alert to, I think, is the quality of the educational material that we're being exposed to, and the sources of that.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one last question before we open it up to questions from everyone. And it's on behalf of my fellow gardeners. Because right now we have perhaps the biggest conversion of the Ontario public, well, Canadian public, into becoming their own growers, because everyone can. What are the consequences of that? Having homegrown material that you can just pick off your porch? Sounds kind of lovely, but what? What's going to happen there?
That's where you get your best tomatoes.
Is it
we'll
safe?
have cannabis-infused tomatoes.
I mean, is it safer, less safe than licensed producer produced material than all of the other material you can get in dispensaries? That's something I just find interesting.
I think the safety will come down to the science of the content of the pharmacology, you know, all the things, the content of the THC, the dose, the whatever. So that's to do with the safety, and of course, presumably the contaminant issue and so on wouldn't be there with home growth. But the same issues do exist around who's going to get access to it. I suppose if you can concentrate it into a concentrated form, I'm not an expert at all on that kind of thing. So potentially people could create high-dose products or edibles, which kind of have their own fairly serious dangers in terms of. Again, it's a bit of an unknown.
I completely agree. And, you know, my guess is with legal plants, you know, you're supposed to have 4 per person per household. Per household,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah, that's good.
My guess is there's going to be information on the internet on how to, you know, grow and breed, you know, more potent strains that have higher THC content. We'll see. You know, it's interesting. Colleagues of mine in the Hamilton area, they've done surveys of medical marijuana users, you know, where there's a predefined content, and they've asked them, you know, what is what are the reasons, what are your motives for using medical marijuana, being in the medical marijuana program? And it's interesting, we would expect that, the number one indication is for pain control, but more than 85% of them say in their top two reasons is to get high. So, there is, my worry is, human nature is what it is. People have their own motives for doing things that may not always be in their best interest. So,
Yeah.
so big question mark.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'll
Perfect.
open it up for questions. As you probably guessed, David Hammond, who is a public policy expert, couldn't be here. And we do have other kind of expertise here. So we have a roving mic somewhere. There's Tom. So if you put your hand up, Tom, you want to go?
A question arising out of the last point in Professor George's final slide about physicians. What training, if any, is available to physicians whose patients ask them to prescribe cannabis, and what's happening in training to help them deal with the probable, maybe inevitable effects?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. Thank you for that. So what I would tell you is, if you're going to become a medical marijuana prescriber, the training that's required for that is quite minimal. Okay, you just have to basically get, authorization from Health Canada, which is fairly straightforward. There's a modest training that you have to do, and one of the challenges for us is that in medical schools like U of T and throughout the rest of the country, the amount of training for medical students, residents, is quite limited in addiction unless, maybe you specialize in addictions. Moreover, as I said, for treatment of addiction, including cannabis, there are very limited opportunities for treatment. There's limited capacity. So we're very lucky in Toronto because we have places like CAMH and other teaching hospitals that have addiction services. It's interesting, we probably have the only dedicated treatment clinic in the country for cannabis at CAMH in our addiction service. And yet, okay, fine, only 9% of people get addicted to it, maybe it's higher in adolescence, but 9% of people who try it, and knowing that at least 50% of Canadians have tried it, and probably about 4% develop problematic use, 4% of 35 million people is a lot of people, right? So where do those people get help? And so how you address that is to have robust physician and healthcare provider education programs, as Dr. Ross suggested. And that is one of the great challenges for us, I think.
Another question? Got lots of lady right here.
I understand that the edibles are a whole different story from smoking, and that I guess I'd like you to expand on that, why it's a whole different consumption of edibles.
So with, edibles, there's lots of considerations. There's the kind of pharmacokinetics, so that there's a delay in response, so nothing happens maybe for a period of time, and then of course that may have issues around people taking more than they anticipated or more than they planned because they don't feel any effect of being high, and then they keep taking more. So there's a risk that people will take a lot, a high dose, and have some kind of harm come from that in terms of some kind of acute psychosis. And I think that kind of acute psychosis risk is maybe more prevalent with high dose smoked or edibles, where people can, there's been examples of people, for example, in the US, there's a chocolate bar that, and in the small print it says contains 12 servings, but whoever ate a chocolate bar and 12 servings, and of course people would then eat the whole bar, and actually it's pretty, there've been some very kind of actually serious harms coming to people because of that. So that's a risk with edibles. Then there's impaired driving, where you may start to drive and not realize that you're actually going to become very intoxicated. So in general, edibles can become very concentrated and have quite a lot of those kind of issues around them.
And because edibles currently are not legally sold in Canada, they're all home produced, you yourself don't have a method for measuring the concentration of these cannabinoids in the material. So you have to sort of learn what you are eating, which, how many of us eat 12 servings of chocolate bars at 12 different times?
That's right. And, just to add, more complexity to that, you've all heard of e-cigarettes and vaping. So what I understand that's very common, particularly amongst youth, is they are opening up their e-cigarettes, their third generation e-cigarettes, which you can replace, the fluid and stuff, and stirring in, oils and cannabis in various solutions and other drugs and synthetics. And so, there's edibles, there's going to be oils, and there's, I've even seen like lip balms and hand lotions are being aggressively marketed. So, and that is the big question, as you point out, Leslie, is that there's no regulation of content, and that's another challenge for us.
Another question? Let's need a gentleman with right behind right there, and we'll move to the back.
Hello. I had a question around looking at the medical area. So as you discussed, there are a lot of different factors that influence the way we react to cannabis. And I mean, I'm sure you've read a lot of the studies showing, some positive effects for specific patients, and the fact that it does vary on a lot of different levels. I was curious if you know about any progress towards assessing that receptibility and being able to predict a little bit more in terms of effects and looking at those factors as a whole. I'd love to hear more about that.
I think one thing we really desperately need are some good, robust, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials. That's what we always talk about in pharmacology. It's what we teach our students, and that's what we know. There are some of those for some cannabis extracts, particularly in pain. There have been some good studies, and there is the epilepsy study with CBD. But really, that's it in terms of what we would call robust clinical data. So, when you see someone saying, this strain works for depression, this works for anxiety, this is based on zero solid clinical data. Now, of course, people have anecdotal evidence. It helped me. It helped, and that's where we really need to get completely away from anecdote and get to solid clinical robust data. And the question for me is, how are we going to get that? Because these clinical trials are really expensive. Who's going to pay for it? And now that we have a legal up market where people can kind of self-medicate in inverted commas, and where people can potentially make profits for medical use for conditions that haven't been verified by evidence, I worry that money will not be spent on those really expensive clinical trials where we get really good evidence to patients that need the data of safety and efficacy. And I always say this one kind of story, which is, kind of illustration is, if we were to do a really good clinical trial on 5 milligrams a day of a new medicine for anxiety, you wouldn't then say, go into your family doctor, and the family doctor said, just take 500 milligrams a day, you'll be fine. So, we're basing a lot of things on epidemiology, say that 1970s cannabis didn't do too much harm to mental health. But now we're saying, in that case, we're quite safe with 30% or 50%. So we need very solid scientific assessment, particular and doses and so on, which we really don't have at the moment.
And I would just add that in the U.S., CBD has now been approved by the FDA, as the brand name is Epidiolex. And of course, the specific indication is for a particular form of pediatric epilepsy. But once, of course, you get Health Canada or FDA approval, physicians can start prescribing it for whatever they feel is indicated. And as Dr. Ross pointed out, whether it's THC or CBD, we're lacking in clinical trials. And I guess one of our collective worries is that with recreational cannabis that's nationwide, people are just going to start selecting what they want to treat that may or may not be supported by the evidence. So I think there are various iterations of this, but for medical therapeutic cannabis, there are substantial clinical trials for pain, particularly back and neck pain, for the spasticity in multiple sclerosis and for neuropathic pain, like the pain you get in diabetes and HIV neuropathies. And beyond that, there's not much. And yet, if you look at most, what Health Canada puts out, what, various other agencies put out, there are many more indications that may not be substantiated. So I think, that's where the importance of doing this kind of research may get lost in the legalization era.
And I think the key thing is that it's not just that the cannabis might not work for those things, it might actually make them worse. And people should have that information before they're actually exposing themselves to something that might make their anxiety worse. So that's a real concern, a major concern, I think.
There's a question from near the back somewhere, Tom. If there's a...
Yes, my name's Carl Brond. I first want to applaud everybody for coming here today to openly discuss this wonderful plant. I was invited to come here. I wish I read a little bit ahead of time, but basically I represent a group of patients who grow and cultivate cannabis medicinally, and based on our charter protections that are equally shared by everybody in this room, I want to remind everybody. And successfully using cannabis personally for around 37 years after being flatlined by a drunk driver back in 1978. Basically, I've been using cannabis about a year and a half afterwards. I would have been about 17 and a half years old. I discovered hash, and once I took my first inhale of hash, my life basically leveled out, and I went, whoa. I had amnesia prior to that, a severe head injury, and like I said, I flatlined. So I was in La La Land until I discovered hash, but I was under the impression it was a vice. I was led to believe it was not good for me and it was taboo. So from then on until about 2002, I was under the bus, and like everybody else who enjoyed that ride under Prohibition. So I represent a group of patients who went to Supreme Court and fought the federal government and took them to court and defended our rights to grow our gardens. So the Cannabis Rights Coalition, and there were a number of growers who existed prior to that who went left instead of right, and they were actually basically sold out by the licensed producers. So the licensed producers took those growers to grow their products, and the other patients stayed at ground zero and said, we're going to defend our gardens. So my question is, coming to it, as well the derivatives, the rights to utilize derivatives. I had too many photos of too many slides up there to bring to mention, but there was one in particular when you were talking about the deliveries methods, vaping, smoking, edibles. There's another awesome delivery method, which is bombs, and that's an infused coconut oil that I use for arthritis and all sorts of gems, anything from skin tags to whatever. So bottom line is, when you're wondering about fear and mongering and the worries about cannabis, nobody talked about this in 1923 on Parliament Hill before they took it from us overnight. And it was a simple removal. Nobody knew any better, and since then we've been on synthetic pharmaceuticals. So my question is, thank you. My question is, why on this planet of Mother Nature and Father Time did they give us this plant that for 100 years has been taken from us? And now when it came to Canadian government's turn to lead globally how to return the plant back to the people equally and fairly, why on earth did they circumnavigate the whole reason we're actually here talking about cannabis in the first place, which is for medicinal benefits?
Okay, thank you.
Why did they circumnavigate and pull out a rabbit out of a hat called recreational marijuana? Can't believe it. And let's just refer to it as cannabis from now on, please.
Okay.
So yeah, why did they just do that?
So maybe Leslie can start off with sort of traditional use of the plant and stuff. And, it's been around.
So it is an interesting history, and one of the sort of the circumstances in which all of a sudden the plant got shifted onto scheduled lists of narcotics whether or not you agree with that it was moved onto those lists, was largely associated with a number of innovations at the time. We developed hypodermic needles. And hypodermic needles then allowed doctors to deliver particular doses. We also saw the development of things like aspirin, which, again, while it's a plant-derived form, it's something that doctors could predict what the consequence was of giving a patient aspirin. As we've heard from both of these world experts, one of the interesting things about cannabis is it's sometimes hard, and I'm sure many of your patients know that even if you use the same plant product and pass it to somebody else and they use it, there are different responses by humans to exactly the same medicine. And so that's one of the complications about cannabis, is that it's very difficult so far to predict what's going to happen. My personal impression is that it's because of the breeding. So the way that the breeding happens in cannabis is fascinating. Because it's been so illicit for such a long period of time, the breeding of cannabis is incredibly different than the breeding of corn. With corn, I know exactly how tall that plant should be, exactly how many cobs it should produce, exactly the length of the cob, because we have done very controlled forms of breeding that involve massive numbers of plants and has very precise crosses. In contrast, cannabis, because of its illicit nature, has largely spent its time not being diminished in its genetic diversity, but is rather promoted to have genetic diversity, and then there's the method of clonal reproduction. And so because of that, we don't literally know what is in each single plant, and we can't consistently produce, even within the same family of seeds, we can't produce it. And so I think in large part, that is a major contributor to why we've seen it shift around in terms of access and putting it on these lists of scheduled drugs. However, I think that is changing. There's been some wonderful breeding happening in Israel. They've done some phenomenal work with breeding. We've also seen some wonderful breeding happen out of Leiden in the Netherlands. And so we are starting to see the development of recombinant inbred lines, the same ideas we use for corn breeding. We are going to see an increase in the consistency of the product, but it's simply not there. That's my impression, but I think it'd be interesting to hear your perspectives too.
I'm not sure I remember the question exactly, but I suppose your kind of point is this. I mean, I've spoken over the years to lots of people who, back in when I was back in Scotland, I met lots of people, before we had the MS data, and lots of people with MS who found huge benefits in terms of muscle contractures and so on, who were in this kind of no man's land of it was illegal, but they found a huge benefit from it. So I totally hear that in terms of this whole medical use, and that's why I keep kind of returning to this point from my perspective. It's important that we get a handle on that. We spend some research funding actually understanding what works for who, what's safe, and I am frightened that in this environment, the medical use is going to be really, we're not going to have such a focus on that, and we're not going to get good information for people who will benefit, but also people who might be harmed. I mean, all medicine is often all about risk-benefit ratios and things that, heroin's natural, and because something's natural doesn't make it always wonderful, but there clearly are benefits from lots of natural products. So we need to get research and good information. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, it's wonderful to hear, individual stories from people like yourself, who have long histories of using that, and we would no way want to invalidate your experiences or that of your fellow patients who have benefited from this. It all comes down to the risk-benefit ratio, as you talked about, Dr. Ross, and we want to minimize harm. So, and I also worry about with legalized pot, we don't want to see the focus taken away from the therapeutic value, either of THC, CBD, or other components of this, and there is a risk of that. And I'm actually worried about the Health Canada medical marijuana program. There are 400,000 people on that program. For the most part, it is, compensable. That is, insurance covers that. Insurance won't cover recreational pot, and I worry that program could be harmed potentially, depending on decisions that are made down the road.
My apologies. It's morphine's natural, not heroin. Morphine's natural.
Yeah, a couple more questions. Over here, back. You get the microphone, please. Wait, yeah, it's coming.
I work with young people in the education system, particularly high school students. And my question / concern for the panel is, given that the age of legalization is going to be kind of post-high school, what about this population? Are they still going to be getting their marijuana from illicit sources? And what are the implications of that, in the context of a legalized environment for some and not for others? And then the second question that I have is, given the nature of young people, as Dr. George indicated about risk-taking behavior and a certain kind of, need to individuate in terms of not following the advice of their elders, what kind of messaging do you recommend in the context of legalization? Because I think that the vibe is, if it's legal, it must not be all that bad. That's kind of the, so how do you give appropriate messaging that will encourage abstinence or responsible use, and not create a backlash, and who's available to do that, or what resources are available to people who work with young people?
I'll start with maybe the last point you made. Thank you for those points. And I know already the government of Canada is starting to air TV ads that, are directed to youth. So a colleague of mine in Montreal, Dr. Patricia Conrad, has already started to be on TV, giving little brief messages directed to adolescents about potential, downsides of this, including driving, on mental health and brain development and stuff like that. She's a leading researcher in this area. And my concern, particularly with the age limit now of 18/19 across the country, is already among 15 to 19-year-olds in Canada, our prevalence rate or prevalence of use of cannabis is 28.5%. If you look at comparable American legalized states, they're just over 20%. So Canada has amongst the highest rates of youth cannabis use in the Western world. And so how will this, and that's before legalization, how will it change that? So I think as many people now today have pointed out, it's all about the messaging we have to youth. And clearly fear-mongering is not going to work. The Project DARE in the United States was an unmitigated disaster. That is just say no, this is your brain on drugs, that kind of thing. We know that won't work, right? So we need thoughtful, nuanced messaging. And I think, I've been working with the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse, who are very interested in this issue, and they are, all committed to public education. And we need more of it. And we need this happening in the schools. And we need kids to know that, okay, there's pot, there's other drugs, these are the risks that you need to know about. And we need to have conversations about this. I don't think we've given youth a lot of input into having conversations about this. And I don't know if teachers and educators feel prepared to give that education. We as physicians don't feel prepared. So there's a lot we need to do.
Yeah, I think something we've already touched on this or spoken about it, but certainly some of the promotional material I've seen that's, advertising and promotion was meant to be not permitted in Canada, but clearly it's happening. There is promotional material being produced by the licensed producers. And, you know, I've come across a little pop-up sales place in Yorkville, which was very kind of slick. And so it's very much promotional material that looked like it was kind of aimed at, you know, young adults. It was a kind of cool, well presented with lots of people who are obviously very well trained in marketing and promotions. And so I am a bit concerned that that may actually, it's obviously aimed at the legal market, but it may, you know, young people will see that kind of promotional material, and that may kind of impede this whole issue of preventing young, or kind of education around use. If you've got this real, that's back to my kind of mixed messages title. We're really giving an awful lot of mixed messages to young people about this. So it's tricky.
I have one last question here. Then we'll have final thoughts from the panelists.
Hi, I'm Tara Upshaw. I'm actually a former student of Dr. Campbell. So we have, this panel I found has really focused on, you know, the risks and things we should be concerned about from a public health lens. But I also think legalization has created a lot of opportunities for us as a nation. And it would be great if we could maintain the same public interest in alcohol and tobacco. So my question for the panel, or more just asking for comments on the social benefits of legalization and the opportunities that this presents us. And I think from some of the other comments, it's clear that this is a great opportunity to have a discussion with people who are at risk without the barrier of stigma. So I'll just hand that off. Thank you.
That's actually a great question for the sort of the final reflections, actually. Yeah. Perfect.
Hi, Tara. As a botanist, I have to say I've never had more interested conversations about science and about plant science in particular than now. It's been wonderful. And what I think is fascinating is that it sincerely is a gateway conversation into this idea of the relevancy of science. I think the tricky part about all of this is the lack of understanding, the lack of information. I think we've all sort of had this we've been mentioning that there's a lack of information, but there's also a significant lack of understanding that the public doesn't, that we as a society don't know that information. And so I think that has been a fascinating sort of space for us as scientists to really say, science isn't the all-encompassing, all-knowing unit yet, especially about something that we've had around for 10,000 years. Yep. And so that, to me, has really been the most exciting, that this loss of prohibition has really given us the opportunity to dive deep, and for so many of us to really to make discoveries on the fly right now to show the public the role of science in our communities.
Yeah, wow.
I would just, add to that by saying, this is an opportunity to have conversations. We, as has been said many times, we have the opportunity to be a world leader in this area. And I think many people perceive around the world us to be already there, but people are watching very carefully. And I think as a physician, psychiatrist, and scientist, this is a great way to engage people at all levels, especially students, and the young people are going to be the future leaders of this. So, if you can take an evidence-based approach to everything you do, including this issue, I think we'll all be better off for it. So, it'll be interesting to see what the landscape is in 5 to 10 years. Yep. And, whether the challenges, Ruth talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly. I like to call it the good, the bad, and the challenging, sort of soft pedal the ugly a little bit, because, the reality is the train has left the station around legalization. It's probably not going to get pulled back, even if we have a new government, in 2 or 3 years, because there are many incentives to keep the train rolling. And so I think we all think that this is probably the right thing to do from a 30,000 foot level, but it's all about the details, the devil's in the details of how we manage this. So
the good, the bad, and the challenging doesn't have the theme music will never work with that. But I take your point. I think it is as I said at the beginning, I've been working on this for a long time, and it's funny now to be a world expert in something that people are interested in, because often you do research because it's about knowledge generation. It's not necessarily always a hot topic that you're working on. So it's a great opportunity to be. It's exciting, and it's great to see interest in science and actually understanding all the kind of nuances around the topic and the pharmacology. I think I found it a really interesting, and this has been very interesting for me to be in an environment where there are all sorts of different strong opinions, people coming from very different perspectives. I've been with social scientists, health policy people, patient groups, all sorts of different people. And I think I've definitely learned a huge amount from other people. And I think it's an interesting time for actually trying to listen to one another. Because lots of people are very they have strong agendas and strong opinions, as sometimes have I and do I. So really listening to one another and really getting to the bottom of something that's a really helpful going forward, and that brings the best possible outcome in terms of health benefits and minimizing harms, and all the research that we need to do to actually really gather that robust data and move forward. So, thank you.
Okay. So I think we've had a really wonderful presentation and discussion. And on behalf of RCS, I'd like to thank the three panelists for stimulating lots of discussion. So we're going to have coffee and cookies outside. I believe they're regular kind of cookies. And our panelists will be out there in a moment to join you. So if you have other questions for the panelists, they'll be out in the lobby in a few minutes. But please join me in thanking our panelists for a really vigorous